before I forget, as I often do. And also I just want to, and maybe you noticed this, but yesterday I put together, I just want to share that yesterday I put together a glossary of important philosophical vocabulary or terms. And I put that, it's like a PDF. I put it on our Moodle page close to the top. So actually I'll just share the screen so that you can see where it is. And so as you're working through these readings, some of which can be quite difficult and challenging, if you encounter a term that you're unfamiliar with or that gives you interpretive pause, I recommend turning to this vocabulary sheet or glossary. Where is it? Yeah, so it's right here under the general information and resources heading. So glossary of important philosophical terms. If you click on that, I just have it arranged alphabetically. So one term that we encountered already that it's quite foreign, it's of Latin origin, is a priori. So does anyone remember where that occurred in the John Perry dialogue from the first night?
Is that referring to the idea of being before birth? I don't remember where it occurred. I was just asking.
Oh, no, so it came up in response to Miller's first suggestion that who Gretchen Weyrob really is her soul. But this presupposes, if we're using soul as a principle of identity, that is the very medium through which identity is achieved as a kind of act, then you would have to have an independent access to observe the soul and to say that the soul having been observed here is in connection with this particular body, which I'm otherwise observing, and then I can make this connection in different occasions. But because we don't have unfettered access, observational access to the presence of a soul, unlike in the chocolate example, where you come to the conclusion without any difficulty because of your past experience that a particular chocolate in a box of a variety of different chocolates is a caramel because of a design on it. So you've associated the outward appearance of this design with the inner presence of caramel. But that's only because you've had experiential access to both. But when it comes to the soul, we don't have access to the soul insofar as it is by definition an immaterial entity which cannot be observed by way of the five senses, any of the five senses. So then they're brought to, on the direction or under the direction of Weyrob, to conclude that sameness of soul and sameness of body, same soul, same body, is nothing we can know a priori, right? It's not available as a priori knowledge. So we see from the glossary sheet here that a priori is pertaining to knowledge. So a priori is a category, a kind of epistemological category. And epistemology is on this glossary too, under E. But epistemology, just very simply, is the study of knowledge. So it's pertaining to knowledge that is derived independently of sense experience. So just like with the chocolates, you wouldn't be able to know a priori that this particular chocolate contains caramel or coconut or whatever else might be within it until you bite into it. So once you bite into it, that's a part of your experience on the basis of which, or in virtue of which, you come to recognize a certain correlation or association. So since we have no access to the caramel, in this analogy being the soul, then we can't say it's either a priori or a posteriori knowledge, because we don't have access to it experientially. Okay, so that's just to share with you guys that I put together this glossary. It's about 6 pages. And also, if we go through it's not comprehensive by any means, it's not exhaustive. So if we continue through these readings throughout the different weeks and a term comes up that I didn't include on this list, you might, mention it in class or send me an email and I can update the list as we go, helpfully. So you might be on the lookout for jargon, for technical vocabulary within these philosophical writings, that it might be beneficial for you and others to have a definition of, or at least a couple possible definitions. Okay. So a priori, that's an epistemological term. It's an important piece of vocabulary that we'll return to actually at different moments. And it is on the one hand associated with the rationalism, the rational metaphysics and epistemology of Rene Descartes, whom we'll see next time. So just to anticipate that discussion, have in mind that for Descartes, we can know certain things a priori. And so just think about what that might be, and we'll talk about it next week. But Karina, you have your little virtual hand up. Did you want to say something else, or is that?
Yeah, I don't remember exactly what you said, but when you were talking about a priori, you were talking about how we can't observe the soul independently. And we had actually talked about, or at least I talked about this in the breakout rooms, about how your 5 senses aren't necessarily reliable. Like you can do all kinds of like thought experiments about like, is my red your red? And maybe like since I don't feel with your nerves, maybe I feel smooth textures where you feel rough, and we just use the shared language to describe it. So our 5 senses aren't entirely reliable, and I think that the only thing, and the same thing kind of with a lot of our memories in mind, like the entire universe could have been created 5 minutes ago, along with all of our thoughts and feelings and emotions. And so the only thing that you can't really get rid of is just the sense of being, this I am. And so I don't know. What's your take on that?
That's awesome. Yeah, I love that. And you really helpfully set us up for our discussion for next week. I mean, you basically laid out in your own terms Descartes' argument, beginning with skepticism of the veracity or reliability of the senses, and then moving towards the so-called cogito argument, cogito being Latin for I think, which, as we'll see, for Descartes is the one thing that one cannot doubt, that one cannot be skeptical of. So I think that's what you perhaps had in mind when you talked about this sense of being, or in other words, existence. And by the way, that kind of approach to grappling with or responding to this particular metaphysical issue comes up in the beginning of the second night of the dialogue, where Miller says, well, look, when you wake up in the morning, and this is to challenge Weyrob's presentation of the bodily criterion for personal identity. So we come to identify ourselves as ourselves and others as others. So I come to identify you in your 2-dimensional visage in front of me now as identical with your 2-dimensional visage that I saw a couple days ago, because of the presence in each instance of a body. So that's really Weyrob's position. But Miller challenges that on the second night by saying, when you wake up in the morning, before you even open your eyes to even look at the presence of your body with which you're familiar, or before you even move your arm to touch your shoulder or to scratch an itch or anything like that, you have a liminal sense of your own being. That is an attunement, an essential attunement, a simple but essential attunement to your own existence, which doesn't have to be verified or confirmed by an act of bodily recognition or association. And so I mentioned this because Karina reminded me of it with her response, but also because this is more or less the idea that we can tease out of Avicenna's floating man thought experiment, which we'll also discuss next week. So just keep that in mind. And that is another very short reading, the Avicenna floating man thought experiment. So it's on our Moodle page for next week. And it's just a page or two, really less than that, just a couple of paragraphs. Okay, cool. So yeah, that was from breakout room 2. Were there any other insights from your discussion in room 2 that you guys want to share? Well, that was really good. So I appreciate that, Karina. How about some folks from breakout room 1? So Danny, Patrick, Renee Croft, and Shannon. Would you guys care to share something that you talked about?
I thought we had a pretty interesting discussion about the depth of the first question part of it, the depth of I as a pronoun versus he or she, and then we got into would souls have a gender, or what are you referring to with I thought that was we had a pretty good discussion about the gendered pronouns thing, saying that if your soul were to leave your body, it would hang on to the experiences that you have as the gender that you are, but it would no longer have a physicality to have to put that label on. I think it was Danny that said you can't label a soul, like you can't put that as a specific thing, and I thought that was interesting to say.
Cool. Yeah, thanks for that. Did you want to add to what she just said, Danny?
I think, yeah, she pretty much covered it. We we had like a really in-depth conversation on souls and what and how those, like, if you, like, if my soul left my body and went into someone else, it would hold on to all of the experiences, as Renee said, but it would continue to collect the experiences of the new body it inhabits.
Mm-hmm.
And how, yeah, like you can't label something. If a soul is just, if it existed, if, like, you believe in souls, if it existed but it didn't have any physical traits, why label it? Why create something out of it when it could just simply exist and hold on to the experiences that it's had?
Cool. So you guys are saying some very interesting things, metaphysical points about the very nature of souls, what it means to be a soul. And to put together some insight from what you shared, it sounds like you're thinking that the soul is at once a vehicle for and a kind of storehouse for experience, right? So then a soul is like a necessary condition for the very possibility of experience. So if we have experience, then we have a soul as the medium through which that is carried out. And then in the course of that carrying out, various facets, aspects, qualities are sedimented and held onto, which can shape the character of the soul, even after it departs any particular physical grounding or structure. So that's really interesting. Renee, yeah, go ahead.
What you just said was we talked about it early on, like I think it was Shannon asked the question, what is this, or was it Shannon? It was one of them that asked the question, what is a soul versus what is a consciousness?
Mm.
And so we talked about how a consciousness is you controlling yourself, right? Like a consciousness is your present experiences happening right now, and a soul would be the collection of those experiences, like as they're happening or once you're all done. Like if I were to be a soul right now, like a dead person, then I would say, oh, that's who I was, because consciousness would be different than me, because consciousness is who I was then, but soul is kind of what you are, the collection of what happened with your consciousness.
But if you as a soul can say, this is who I was then isn't there still consciousness occurring? Or is it just a different consciousness now?
If you're asking like specifically my opinion, I would
Yeah.
say that a soul is probably not a conscious thing. I look at it as it's a bunch of it would be a bunch of someone's memories and experience, but I don't think that it could continue. Like there are two separate things. There would be a consciousness in your body. There would be this thinking, feeling, experiencing part of you, and your soul is what happens because of that. So once that leaves your body, I think, it's all done, because you're not alive anymore, so your consciousness can't experience and uh tack on more stuff to your soul. So I think it's done. And this, I don't know, in like a fictiony kind of way, the soul would probably remember all the experiences it had with your consciousness, but it's kind of done now,
Yeah.
is my way of thinking.
Yeah, and so another question kind of connected to what you're saying is, to what extent is one soul differentiable from another? That is, are souls distinct and separated only because they are housed, as it were, in separate bodies, such that upon death, when the soul leaves the body, does it just become reintegrated with some non-material and thus non-divided or specific uh, sphere or plenum of other souls or something? Maybe that's what heaven is like. I don't know. But so definitionally, though, this idea that we're working with of soul derives from the Greek word psyche, which is spelled like psyche in English, and is in fact the etymological origin of words like psyche, psychological, psychic, and so forth in English, such that the very discipline of psychology would literally be understood as the study of the soul, the investigation of the soul. And from the Greek point of view, the soul is most fundamentally the condition by which life happens. So what is the soul? It's simply that which endows an organic, or it could be a formerly inorganic body with life. So where there's soul, there's life. Where there is the absence or removal of soul, there is death. So Plato defined the act of death as the process of separation between soul and body. So soul is simply that which gives life a possibility. And so you might say at the essential level, soul endows a given being with certain capacities or abilities. So the very first foundational capacity would be life. Without life, an organism can't achieve anything, can't perform anything. So that's the first capacity that the soul gives. And then it was Aristotle who sort of systematically laid out different layers or dimensions of psyche, differentiating what he called vegetative soul, so plant-like soul, from the animal or appetitive, desirous soul. And then the third kind of soul would be the rational soul, or to use the Greek, noetic, referring to noesis, the process of intellection or the power of thought. And so think of three concentric spheres that are nested within one another, beginning with the vegetative soul, which all living entities share in. So that means, from the Aristotelian point of view, we are all in some way plants. So we share an essential affinity with plants. So think about our bodies, how we carry out these automatic functions, such as organ function, respiration. Our hair grows without any sort of intention or volition, our fingernails and so forth. That's the aspect of our being that we share in with plants. And then in addition to that, there is the appetitive or animal layer of soul that separates animals from plants. And it's this dimension that allows animals to perceive. So it facilitates perception, and it also facilitates locomotion, the ability to move from one place to another, and appetite, desire. And so all of those dimensions of the animal soul play together. So I have the desire for food, I'm hungry, my eyes visually see a plant over there that I might move to grab to satisfy my hunger, and then I can move from my current position to that one, right? And then on top of that, we as human beings are both animals because we have appetite, we have perception, the ability to move. We're also plants for the reasons I just enumerated, But additionally, we have the power of thought or of intellection. We don't need to get into those details too much. But this is the originary Greek conception of soul associated with the word psyche. Okay, so we'll continue to talk in a different way from a modern point of view using Descartes' framework, talking about soul next week. But are there any questions about that? So Descartes will use this definition, and this is the concept around which Miller's own attitude as a Christian chaplain is associated. That is, this concept of the soul as an immaterial substance, right? So think of that definitionally, whether we're beginning with the Greeks or appropriating this modern Cartesian understanding. The soul is an immaterial substance. And not everyone is in agreement. Philosophers throughout various epochs are not entirely in agreement about the intelligibility or logic of that sort of notion. So Thomas Hobbes, kind of a contemporary of Descartes from the 17th century, argued that the very idea of soul as an immaterial substance is a contradiction in terms. He thought it was absurd to talk about an immaterial substance, given that a substance is essentially material, right? And so there are some difficulties with coming to terms with a clear understanding of what the soul entails. Okay, so how about someone from room 3? So either Ale or Robbie, do you guys want to share something that went on?
We had a similar discussion as I think group 1 that just talked, but I think we really discussed prompt 1. I think something unique that we talked about was how nowadays something that's become more popular is to, ask someone what their pronouns are before you really get to, like, if you're just now meeting someone, it's good to ask them what their pronouns are, because that's one way that you can identify their personal identity instead of just identifying them off their physical identity. So I think your gender can be different in your soul, because usually it's kind of like everyone knows, don't judge a book off its cover. That's why you read the back of the book, just to get a kind of an idea of what you're meeting or what you're about to read. Other than that, I mean, we had similar ideas as Renee and Danny.
Cool, yeah, thank you. So yeah, I like that. That suggests that apart from the other qualities that we've associated or attributed to the soul, it is that which gives a being depth beyond the immediacy of bodily presence, right? So this is to say that one's personal identity is not reducible to that which is immediately apparent to an outside observer or to even the individual in question. And that's why we can spend an entire lifetime coming to know ourselves. That's why, referring to last week's discussion, it's inscribed at the Oracle at Delphi to know yourself. That's a kind of divine injunction from the god Apollo. That is what it means to be human, to know ourselves. And it's not an easy job, right? It's something that's very difficult. And so I really like that idea that the soul is that which gives depth beyond what is immediately apparent from any kind of observational access. So that's really interesting. So how about someone from room 4? So Alanis, Malika, or Nancy, do you guys want to share something that you guys talked about?
I think similar to what Robbie said, we also talked about pronouns and how important it is to know what they identify themselves as, so we can know at least who they are a little bit. And when we refer to I in general, we're just myself. There's so many ways you can identify each person with their race or their ethnicity or stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
So just I is just an overall I guess, like a way to identify who they are or talk about themselves.
Yeah, so it's a way to identify, but not, and I think I was getting this from what you were sharing, not in a reductive sense. So reductionism is actually a term I put on that vocabulary sheet. So if you're interested, but to approach this in a reductive way would be to say, if I identify with a particular gender, then my identity can meaningfully be reduced to the pre-established sensibility or terms that mark that gender identity. And so this is where we find problems of gender essentialism, where we say, oh, if you're a man or a male, then that means that you exemplify necessarily, simply in virtue of your being that gender, certain qualities or characteristics, which you would then share interchangeably or anonymously with any other man. And the same could be said about women. So this is problematic gender essentialism. So if I ask for your pronoun and you say, oh, I identify as a woman, that doesn't give me license to say, okay, I've gotten you figured out then, because I've met a woman before. I now know exactly who you are. It just gives us more material by which to navigate the incredibly difficult but necessary task of coming to know someone, and coming to know someone on terms that are amenable to them, right? That are not simply imposed upon them by some reductive picture. And so that requires dialogue, right? That requires engagement, that requires asking questions, and more importantly, listening to what one says. Okay, cool. So are there any other comments or perhaps any questions that you guys have that came out of your breakout room discussions, or anything you want to build on what we've said so far?
I was just gonna kind of add on to what Nancy said because we were kind of talking about it in our breakout room. Uh, we were talking about like how when you're referring to I as someone's pronouns, like, and you're referring to more of like their soul, like who they are, you don't really need to be as like specific on like gender or race or those kind of identities. So it's a little bit more confusing, or there's more of like a question trying to get deeper into certain identities when like referring to someone just as like you, compared to when you're saying I, it's a little bit easier because you know more about yourself, if that makes sense. So it's kind of like confusing to answer that last part.
Yeah,
But
I mean, it's not an easy question, right?
yeah.
It certainly is confusing because identity is confusing. I mean, we're talking about personal identity and this I in a unified and simple sense for each individual, yet we all know that that's not how individuals are. We're very complex, so we have nesting infinitely complex layers of personal identity that can perhaps in different contexts, when they're given to arise, surprise us. Some of you might have heard of, and I mentioned him before, the 19th century German kind of proto-existential philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. He argued that the self is really like a series of concealed and competing polyps, like polyp arms, like a cyst. Right? So you have all these various polyps or extensions that are vying for supremacy, that are wanting to be you at any particular moment. And how you might identify yourself at this precise moment in time is simply because one of those polyps, one of those dimensions of your inescapably deep and rich persona has temporarily achieved victory, has temporarily achieved supremacy, but then at another moment, it will give way to another aspect of yourself. So there's never really any one component that you can rest with and say, ah, I finally arrived at me. I finally reached the deepest level, because it might give way to further complexities. Okay. So let us then turn to, because we're going to spend a lot of the time next week among other things, but principally talking about soul from a Cartesian point of view. So today I want to spend, with the time we have left, the rest of our conversation focused on the idea of memory or consciousness. And so this is the idea that Miller presents in the second day, and we'll see some problems with it. So I am going to share the screen here, some slides. So in the little piece I wrote up to introduce the John Perry dialogue on Moodle, you will recall that there are various philosophical perspectives from primarily the modern period. So we're talking about 18th century, 17th century here, of philosophical ideas that have to do with the question of selfhood or personal identity. So there are figures like John Locke, David Hume, Descartes, who was named, and Locke is named as well. David Lewis is another philosopher, and we'll be turning to him later in the course when we talk about time and time travel. And so this is that question that I posed, this kind of essential guiding question for the first unit of the course. So what is the I that endures through time? Or what is that X, that variable of your persona enduring through time that remains the same, that remains essentially identical despite other changes? So there are various candidates as to adequate responses to this kind of question. And so I've grouped them under various headings. So first we might approach it from the point of view of trying to apprehend some substance. And by substance, I mean literally drawing on the etymology of that term. So think of substance as sub, meaning below, under, and then stance, standing forth. So a substance is literally that which underlies, what lies beneath a series of potentially shifting properties. So John Locke thought about substance as, like if any of you sew or are familiar with sewing, like a pin cushion. So the substance is like a pin cushion, and the qualities that the substance contains or supports are like the pins in the cushion. And those pins can be removed and changed. Okay, awesome. Yeah, perfect. Thanks for a visual, Renee. That's great. But that kind of analogy or metaphor is going to open up a certain difficulty, as we'll see, a metaphysical difficulty. But so we can think of this enduring self as a substance, in other words, an object or a thing which supports various qualities. And so there are various ways to use this theoretical grounding. So first of all, we could say that the substance at issue that captures the I is the body. And that's Gretchen Weyrob's position. So she says the principle of identity is simply the body, which means metaphysically that once the body perishes, the I perishes. And it also means epistemologically that when we identify someone as the same across different moments, the principle that allows that kind of recognition or knowledge is the body as well, and nothing beyond it. No spooky substance like the soul. And so it could be the soul. So instead of the body, it could be, as we've defined it so far, an immaterial substance. Or it could be the organism. An organism is strange because it might actually fit under self as process too, at the same time that we could put it under self as substance. And we'll talk more about what I mean by organism in just a moment versus, say, body. So we'll return to these candidates in order to see what recommends them, so good reason to support these ideas, but also to clarify difficulties or problems that arise. So just very quickly, what is a problem if Gretchen Weyrob is right? So if all there is to personal identity or selfhood is our body, well, what are some problems with this? And remember, the question we're asking is, what is the I that remains unchanged, that is self-same and identical despite other changes? So if we identify that as the body, then what are some difficulties that we encounter?
Well, our body isn't the same as we grow and change. You know, every single atom in our body has been replaced time and time again. So we can't define the body as something that remains unchanged because it's not unchanged. It changes every day.
Yeah, great. So that's the first obvious problem with this view. And we'll see that in just a moment when we get into the theory of Locke. The body is constantly changing, right? So our cells are replaced every 7 years, right? And so this is a problem that we'll turn to when we get to Hume in a couple of weeks, that's laid out for us in a classical thought experiment known as the ship of Theseus. So just to give us a point to anticipate that a little bit, imagine that there is a ship that goes out to sea on voyage, and it's on a long voyage, let's say many, many months, or perhaps even years. And over the course of this trip, it undergoes all sorts of problems, and each plank is progressively replaced over time, one by one. So in the end, when the ship comes back to port, could you really say, given that every single wooden plank that makes it up is the same ship? And if we want to say it's the same ship, in what sense, right? So that's just another problem that we'll turn to in detail a little bit later. But then the problem of soul. So there is an epistemological problem that we've talked about already last class, and then there's a metaphysical problem. And we won't really talk about the metaphysical problem until next week when we get to Descartes. And that's a problem specifically for his theory. But does anyone remember what the epistemological problem was that we talked about last time when it comes to soul?
That we don't see it or we can't touch it.
Good, good. So actually, let me see. Let me stop sharing just real quick and use the whiteboard, because this will be helpful in clarifying the argument. Let me see. So let's see, on page so the bottom page 5, and then around the top of page 6, Weyrob is laying out this critical argument in response to Miller. So she says, if such judgments, this is on the top of page 6, if such judgments were really about souls, so judgments like the one I make, for example. So I see Renee on the screen in front of me, and I recognize that she's the same Renee that I saw in front of me on my computer on Tuesday. So I make an identity. How do I do that? He says, if these judgments, or she says, excuse me, if these judgments were really about souls, they would all be groundless and without foundation. So if I'm able to recognize Renee now as the same Renee that I saw on Tuesday because of the enduring presence of her soul, well, then it would be entirely mysterious how I'm able to make that identity, because I don't see, I don't observe, I don't experience her soul. So she says, we have no direct method of observing sameness of soul. And so this is the point made by the candy example. We can have no indirect method either. This is an argument form that she's using in classical logic known as modus tollens. And as an argumentative form in deductive logic, and I encourage you to look up deductive logic in the philosophical vocabulary sheet that I provided. In deductive logic, a valid argument form is such that regardless of whatever content is built into the argument, so whatever you're trying to argue about, whatever you're trying to conclude, it doesn't matter if you have plugged that in to a valid deductive form, well, then it will always yield for you a valid conclusion that is always correct. And this is, for this reason, we can turn to a priori reasoning. We can say that insofar as a conclusion is reached on the basis of the work achieved by a valid deductive argument form, we can know the truth of that conclusion a priori. And so I'll give you the example of the modus tollens argument here. So let's say line 1, so this is premise 1. So I'm going to use the symbolic language because this is a formal language, and then I'll explain to you what these terms mean. All right, so here's the argument. It's as an argument, a conclusion. So that's what we see here in line 3, distinguished from the preceding lines by a horizontal line. And so what's above that horizontal line, lines 1 and 2, are the premises of the argument. So every argument is made up of one conclusion, and it has to have at least one premise that justifies or supports it. So line 1, and I'll read it into an English language sentence. So let's say S means we judge identity because of soul. So soul is the principle of identity. And this little arrow is the symbol for a hypothetical statement, an if-then statement. And then the M means mysterious. So the sentence in line 1 reads, if souls are the principle of identity, so that by which we make identity judgments, then it would be, so if souls are that principle, then it would be entirely mysterious how we make these identity judgments, okay? The second premise, so that little squiggly line, it's a tilde, so that's a negation. So the second premise says it's not mysterious. It isn't mysterious how we make judgment claims about identity. And because of that, we can conclude, therefore, it can't be because of souls. Souls cannot serve as the principle of identity by which we make identity judgments, right? So does that make sense? This is an example of modus tollens. So it begins with a hypothetical, an if-then statement. The second line is always a denial of the consequent of the hypothetical, which means you can deny the antecedent. So the letter that comes before the little arrow there. Right? So she's using a formal argument to conclude with deductive validity, that is a kind of necessary certainty that there is an epistemological flaw in Miller's argument that recommends souls as the principle of identity. Okay. So are there any questions about that? That's just to give you an example of how logic is put to work here, but the language wasn't very clearly delineated or explicitly laid out or stated in the reading. So let's jump back to the slides. Hold on. Okay. Yeah, so now we're going to turn to Locke. So this handsome devil here is the 17th century, 18th century is sort of in both. British philosopher, a metaphysician, epistemologist, as well as social political thinker, John Locke. And this excerpt is from his 1689 work, An Essay Concerning Human Understanding, which is possibly one of the worst things you could ever possibly read. It is painful. Locke is incredibly dry, so you should thank me for not having you actually read Locke.
500.
But So this is how he defines the person. And this is actually a concept of personhood that we still use today. And this is very much at play or at issue in debates of a far-reaching nature, such as debates about the legitimacy of abortion, right? So is the fetus a person? So often John Locke in his definition is turned to for this reason, or in this kind of context. But what is a person? He says a person is, I think, a thinking being that has reason and reflection and can consider itself the same thinking thing in different times and places, which it does only by that consciousness which is inseparable from thinking and seems to me essential to it, it being impossible for anyone to perceive without perceiving that he does perceive. And so that last line is really what we mean by, and this is another philosophical term, and one which I just remember I didn't put on the glossary sheet, but apperception. So it's like perception, but with an A and an additional P attached to it. So apperception. Apperception is, I think I have it typed out here in one of the slides anyway, but apperception is different from normal perception in that in apperceiving, an individual is perceiving that they are perceiving. So in apperceptual consciousness, you are not only conscious of some object, but you are further conscious that you are conscious. So it's thinking that you are thinking. So essentially for Locke, personal identity is apperception. Yeah. So the principle of identity for Locke, apperception, to perceive that you are perceiving. And this is a special kind of self-consciousness that necessarily entails the work of these three elements. So there's thinking, such that you can think that you are thinking. There's time, such that you can think or cognitively recognize yourself as the same person who is thinking or perceiving or conscious at these other moments. And what is the ligament, or the ligature, I should say, that binds thinking in this temporal stretch? So what is the medium through which that happens? Well, it's memory. So this is why memory becomes essential for consciousness. And insofar as consciousness is essential for the idea of apperception, it's really at the very heart of John Locke's theory of personal identity. But what is identity in general? So we're talking about personal identity when it comes to conscious entities, sentient organisms like human beings, and it might even extend this to other sentient entities like our family pets, dogs or cats. We might want to say that they have a kind of persona as well, and the idea that Locke is floating, although he denied that. He thought that apperception is something peculiar to human consciousness. But identity in general, we can assign to anything, even this lid for my coffee receptacle, right? It is itself, it is self-same. So identity just means being one thing and not another. So when I see this, I identify it as the very lid for my coffee receptacle that I've used on a number of occasions before. So a blade of grass has an identity. It is this blade of grass that you see before you, and not say that blade of grass over there, even though in all other respects they are interchangeable. They look precisely the same. They're strictly speaking not, because they share, at the very least, that is to say, they don't share, they have or enjoy different spatial locatedness as a property or a quality that demarcates their identity from that which they are not. So this blade of grass, if I were to pluck a blade of grass from the earth and then pluck with my other hand another blade of grass, and they look very much the same, they are not identical in the strict sense, because they can never occupy the same volume or measure of space, right? They, in other words, exclude each other from a particular area. So then we have these two ideas when it comes to identity. An individual object cannot be in two places at once, and two distinct individuals cannot be in the same place at the same time. And if they are, they're no longer two distinct individuals. They have become one. So what Locke and other philosophers are searching for is this principle of individuation, as he puts it, or we might say, using the same acronym, POI, principle of identity. And so that's what we're asking about at the beginning today. What is that X enduring through time that remains the same despite other changes? So consider a photo of yourself as a toddler. This picture is of me as a child, you might say, but why? So what is it that makes you and the child in the photograph one and the same individual person? So as you can see, babies actually have more bones than adult humans. So let's assume that this is this man. So on the left, this man is a toddler, at which point in his life he had 300 bones, and then eventually they fused and some disappeared, and eventually has 206. But he wants to say, looking at this photograph on the left, in some crucial sense, it's still me, right? So what exactly is it that makes that possible? So Locke, in his pursuit of the principle of individuation, presents us with three distinctions. So when it comes to identity, there are three ways it can be constituted or take shape. So on the one hand, we can deal with, as we discussed earlier, substances. So a substance would be the material stuff that constructs or makes up an object. So you might say, more scientifically, reductively, the atoms or the molecules, the cells, or perhaps just the parts or particles that make it up, such as organs or body parts. But then in addition to substance, we can talk about organisms. So this refers to not just any material entity, but a living body that is composed of parts, and those parts are not just incidentally thrown together in any arbitrary fashion. They're organized intelligibly to serve particular functions, right? So that's what distinguishes an organism from a mere substance. It, like a substance, is composed of various distinguishable parts, but those parts all work together almost like a kind of machine, you might say, to achieve a particular end. And then lastly, there's the person, according to Locke, and we define that already. So a person for Locke is a rational, reflective, thinking, self-aware thing, capable of apperception, perceiving that one does perceive. And so this is what we call the self. It is the me to which I refer when I say I or myself. I'm not simply referring to my body, because I might, when cooking one night, cut my finger off, right? Yet I'm still me. Or I might undergo a quadruple amputation if I experience some horrific trauma. But I would still be me in an important respect, even though my body has been changed, right? And even my organism in that regard would be changed. So does this make sense? Any questions about these distinctions so far? Okay, and feel free to just jump in if you have a question or if you'd like to make a comment. So we'll talk about each in turn. So first, substance. When we're talking about the identity of individual objects or substances, the principle of individuation or principle of identity is mass, this kind of scientific characteristic or measure. So inanimate objects, such as my coffee receptacle lid, the computer I'm staring at, the chair I'm sitting in, the clothes I'm wearing, and so forth, inanimate objects are substances only. They are neither living organisms nor persons. And so for this reason, the principle of individuation for such entities is just its stuff. That is, its mass. So if you take a rock, like I presented an image of here. So if you were to take this rock and a little chisel or something, and you were to chip off maybe a almost imperceptibly small bit of it, strictly speaking, when it comes to identity, it's no longer the same rock because you've altered its mass. Now you have the original rock, which has been defaced, it's been altered, so it's no longer strictly speaking the original, and also now a second entity, a second substance, that is the small piece that I managed to chisel away from it. So now where there was something identical, self-same before, the one rock, I have two entities, neither of which are identical as the one entity that I had at the beginning. And so for this reason, if I think of my own body as a substance, if I lose a single hair on my head, I am not the same anymore, strictly speaking. My body as substance has changed. Okay, so does that make sense? Now, what about the second category, organism? So when it comes to substance, the principle of identity or individuation is mass. When we're talking about organism, that principle is life. So note that living things, such as plants and animals, are both substances and organisms. But according to Locke, of course we can disagree with him on this, as I tend to, they're not persons, except for human beings. So the thing that makes a living entity like an oak tree, so here's an image of a pretty impressive oak tree for you. The thing that makes up a living entity like an oak tree constituting its sameness across time, it's not the matter that makes it up, because the oak was once a sapling, before that it was an acorn, and it continuously, in the process of development, loses old parts and are replaced by new ones. Yet we want to say, because there is a determinate line of development or evolution within this particular entity, it's the same. It remains the same tree, just as human beings are organisms as well. So I want to say that I am, although different in important respects from who I was as a toddler, insofar as I'm dealing with myself as organism, I am the same. So then, what is it that makes an oak tree, a toddler, that is a human being at different points of their experiential development? What makes these entities the same? Well, it's life. That is to say, the organization of parts to whole by which life happens. So as long as it remains one continuous life, it hasn't ended and been replaced by a new life. So as long as there is one continuous life, we'll say it's the same oak tree and not a new oak tree if it grows a new branch or loses a branch or whatever else, or it takes on a blight, and because of that its leaves now look differently, have spots or a different color. Okay. But what is then, lastly, what is the principle of individuation or identity when it comes to the kind of being that we are, we as human persons? So Locke rejects the idea that the principle of individuation of persons is the same as that of material substances. Well, we already talked about this. So this is what Karina contributed earlier when we were talking. If I lose a material body, part of my body, I'm the same person. You cut off my foot, I'm still the same person. My body has changed, but my personal identity has not. Now, how I experience life is of course going to be quite different if I no longer have a foot, but I'm still recognizable, either for my part, knowing who I am, and also for others who can engage in conversation or activities with me as me, someone they know. So it's pretty straightforward why the principle of individuation of persons can't be substance. or mass. But he also rejects the idea that the principle for persons is the same as it is for organisms. So he gives us this famous thought experiment to make the point. And it's usually referred to as the prince and the cobbler experiment. So imagine, if you will, and there are all sorts of, films and stories about this, like Freaky Friday you might have seen, or Prelude to a Kiss, or all kinds of kind of sci-fi scenarios in which one consciousness is moved to another body. And so he's talking about this in the 17th century. It's pretty wild. But imagine that the memories or consciousness of a prince were transferred to the body of a cobbler. When the cobbler wakes up, he thinks he's the prince without even opening his eyes. He just has the consciousness of the prince. He claims to be the prince, has all the memories of the prince, etc. Meanwhile, the cobbler's consciousness goes into the prince's body. We would say that the prince now inhabits the living body or organism of the cobbler, and also vice versa. Yeah, director John Locke. Right. Wasn't that Lindsay Lohan in that movie? I'm trying to remember. I think so. I'm not sure. But yeah, so then this thought experiment from Locke's point of view is sufficient to allow us to conclude that the principle of individuation for persons, that is conscious, apperceptive beings, is not reducible to that of organism, which means, in other words, whatever we might be, we are always something more. We are always something as persons above and beyond what we can characterize in terms of our organismic structure or our substantial bodily presence. Okay. So does this thought experiment make sense to you? So if you were to switch bodies with someone, and maybe you're unaware that it happened, so you haven't really looked at yourself or passed a mirror or something, you're very much in the thick of your own existential presence. You know who you are in an immediate intuitional sense. And that immediate intuitional sense puts you in a place to recognize yourself as something other than what is made available to us in terms of these criteria associated with substance or organism. Okay. So now building on this, people like Rene Descartes argue that when it comes to personal identity, there is some essential non-material part of us that remains enduring, unchanged. And this is referred to as the soul, as a kind of immaterial substance. Now, Locke didn't reject the existence of souls on metaphysical grounds. By all accounts, he was a fairly, pious, religious person. But he did identify the epistemological problem with leveraging the soul as the principle of identity or individuation. And these are the reasons. So we can imagine the same consciousness being transferred to a different material object or soul, right? So think of that prince and the cobbler situation, but where, in this case, instead of just consciousness being transferred from one, let's say, brain to another, now consciousness has been transferred from one brain, that is body, to another, but also to another soul. So the soul hasn't changed, but the memories have, right? But the person who wakes up as the prince, as being conscious of as the prince in the cobbler's body, and in the cobbler's soul, despite having a new body and soul now, it would still identify as the prince, right? So the soul doesn't seem to change anything. Does that point make sense? Because we can imagine consciousness, memories, ideas, experiences being transferred not only to a new bodily container, as it were, but a new psychic container, that is to say, a new soul. Okay, and then the second problem On the other hand, we can imagine the same soul being shared by two persons. So imagine that when Socrates died, his soul entered another body. So let's think reincarnation. So now imagine I am Socrates, reincarnated. Does that necessarily entail that Socrates and I share the same identity? Well, no, if that were true, then if I come to know that I am the reincarnation of Socrates, I might feel responsible for whatever crimes I committed. I mean, Socrates, as we know, didn't feel responsible. He didn't think he had done anything wrong. But in addition, Socrates 2,000 years ago would be reasonable in anticipating my life, my life experiences. But we don't think, just judging by our ordinary intuition, that so if you think Socrates was guilty, you wouldn't suppose that I should be held responsible for his crimes, even if it's true that I am the reincarnation of Socrates. Nor does it seem reasonable when looking at anticipation to the future to think that Socrates could have expected and anticipated the life experiences that would be possible for me in my own life, say 2,400 years or so later. So these thought experiments for Locke bring us to conclude that even if we do have souls and souls do important work, they can't serve when it comes to persons as the principle of individuation or identity for these reasons. Okay. And so let's say that Locke is right. What problems arise? And so there are several problems, some of which are addressed and responded to in the reading, in the John Perry dialogue, but not all of them, right? But if the principle of individuation is memory, what about, this is a major problem, right? And so this is the one that is actually worked through and grappled with explicitly in the text. False memories. What about memory loss? So my grandmother has dementia, she's in memory care. Does that mean that she is not the same person, that she has an essentially different identity in who she is now from who she was before? Because she has lost her memory. Is she really a different person? Or what about how we're all in our own ways unreliable narrators when it comes to characterizing our own past, right? So even accidentally, there's this extreme danger of falsifying in our own minds and communicating that falsification to others of what happened to us or what we experienced or what we did even a few minutes earlier, right? There are all kinds of scientific experiments carried out that demonstrate the unreliability of our memories. Earlier we talked about, because of a comment that Karina made, the unreliability of our senses, and we'll spend more time discussing that next week. But what about the unreliability of our memories? So there is recent research in accordance with which it's now possible to physically implant memories in mice. So it's a little, gruesome, but the mouse's little cranium is opened up, and using photons, so using light, scientific experimenters can introduce a memory to the present consciousness of a mouse that will affect their behavior in various ways. So perhaps through a photon, a memory or the thought in the consciousness of a predator, like a cat, is introduced. Well, once that happens, the mouse will freeze up and its little heart will start racing, right? And so this shows by outward points of observation or measure that this memory has been introduced, but has been introduced through a kind of artificial causation, right? So, and And this is the problem that they discuss in the dialogue. It seems to make sense to connect memory, importantly, to who we are, our ongoing consciousness from various experiential situations in our life. But what about the danger of these false memories? So I kind of lost my train of thought there. So it seems to make a lot of sense, but what I was going to say is, in terms of how this is discussed in the dialogue, we don't want just any old memory to be in place as a potential source of identification or identity of an individual from one moment to the next, because there has to be the appropriate causal origin as to how one memory comes about. And so I talked about how you can use photons in a kind of laboratory setting to physically introduce artificial memories, but it's also much more easily done through the power of suggestion. And there's a lot of psychological and sociological research about this, how easy it is to introduce a memory of something that never even happened to a person. And so there are certain elements that one needs to use and put to work. So if you're familiar enough with someone's background, maybe something that they experienced as a child, you can bring that up and then mention something else that is completely made up, completely false, and you can add that. And if you emphasize it in the right way, you can actually create a memory. The person will say, oh yeah, I kind of remember that. And it will be completely fictitious. So there are these kind of experiments being carried out for that too. So those are problems, the problem of false memories and the problem of memory loss. And the third issue is one that John Locke himself addressed. So punishing the drunkard. So if you get blackout wasted and you do a bunch of crazy shit, you cause some insane scene out in public, and then you black out, you wake up the next day and you have a pounding headache, you're hungover, but you have absolutely no recollection of anything that you did. Since now the principle of individuation, if we understand that to be memory, is not connecting your present identity to the identity that you were the night prior, does it mean that you are, strictly speaking, not the same person? And if that's true, to what extent can you be held responsible for it, right? So you could say, I don't remember doing that. Since I don't remember doing that, it wasn't me who did it. Therefore, you can't hold me responsible. And Locke, for his part, was willing to bite the bullet. He was willing to say, yeah, I guess that's an issue. But that's an issue that we have to embrace, right? But what do you guys think about that? So any comments or questions or ideas about Locke's theory of memory as the principle of individuation for persons? Well, what do you guys think about his theory? Yeah, go ahead, Renee.
I mean, I like throughout all of that, I was thinking that it's not the memories themselves that make the person, but more how the person acts based on the memories. Like, if that makes sense, like the projection of the product of those memories. Like, you are a product of memories, you aren't a collection of them. Like, it's your behavior based on the memories that makes you. So even if you plant a false one in someone, like you plant a false memory in like you were saying with the childhood thing, the person will still behave based on all the other memories. So I don't know, it was a little confusing to me, because wouldn't a person just like learning from experience, wouldn't you as a person be what you've learned from your experiences rather than just the experience itself?
Hmm. So what you, and this goes back to the soul we were talking about earlier as the vehicle and storehouse for experiences. And that might be experiences that we can readily recall through memories. Like if I want to recall a memory of something I did yesterday, I can do it. But maybe it's not always that way, is what you're saying. So I might not be
Yeah.
able to recall something that I did, say, 20 years ago, but in an imperceptible way, maybe that experience is still present with me. Is that kind of what you're suggesting?
I think I'm not very good at making big ideas concise, so apologies in advance. But um, I guess I'm saying more subconscious stuff, like a reflex is also part of you, um like, oh, if I go to Starbucks every day, then tomorrow I'm still going to go out and do that. Like that's not just the memories acting, that's me subconsciously going, yeah, it's that time of day, but that's also like a part of your personality, that
Hmm.
it's more based on what you know inside.
Yeah, Danny, go ahead.
So, the way you said that, like if you go to Starbucks every day, it like kind of like 50 First Dates. It's like she may not, the main character may not remember what she did the day prior, but because she has like subconsciously, like she has this routine or she has some sort of feeling like she does it every day. And it's just a subconscious feeling, and it's the effects of um her experience. Like you, something could happen when you're like 2 or 3 and you may not remember it, but it has still affected you and created who you are. Is that is that kind of
Cool. Yeah, I think that's good. But so this, if it's true, if the self is some kind of inscrutable, overarching personality that takes shape across different times, it could be then that the self is something we can't possibly ever know. uh, and that might be a difficulty that comes out of this theoretical approach to the problem. But yeah, so good. It was a really good conversation today, and we're out of time now. So I'll say just a couple more things about Locke and the dialogue next week before we get into Descartes. But so we will turn very um, emphatically next week to the modern view of self as consciousness, mind, and soul in this Cartesian sense. And so even if you haven't heard of or read Descartes, these are going to be ideas that you're already familiar with because they're so influential and built into our culture. All right, so just keep that in mind. So I'll see you guys next week, next Tuesday, and we'll discuss Descartes and the soul view. So have a great weekend.
Can I talk to you real fast?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Oh, are you waiting too?
Danny,
Someone else.
I think she might be frozen. Okay.
Yeah, she probably is. Yeah. So I'm the one who emailed you yesterday
Mhm.
about joining, kind of like just a little late. So I did end up joining a group. I did end up finding that. I don't know how I missed it. But I looked through for the textbooks, and I know it was talking about like hypothesis or something.
Mhm.
And I looked through that and everything. But is there like a different spot where it says which textbooks we need?
Oh, there are no textbooks. Yeah. So I'll just share the screen and show you.
Oh, because like in the email, you asked if I got the like textbook or materials or something.
Yeah, I was just asking if you were able to access the readings. But
Oh,
the readings
I
are given for free.
yeah, I saw the readings. I just
Oh,
thought
yeah,
there was a textbook.
yeah, that's all I was referring to. Yeah, so there's nothing you have to
Oh,
actually purchase. There's no additional
oh, I see.
text, but just so we're not confused at all. So for last week, so I'm sharing the screen now. For last week, this was the reading.
Mhm.
So as I mentioned in class, because some of these are very difficult, I write up a little introduction. So you should read these introductions and then you click on the reading, and that will be the reading for the week. And it's set up through hypothesis. And so the idea is, you can see here, people are annotating the text. So you have to annotate at least 2 passages of each of these texts. And so to do that, you just like highlight it, and then something will come up to annotate, and then that's when you like type it in.
Okay.
Yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah. I've never used like hypothesis before, but it's probably pretty self-explanatory.
Yeah, it is. And there's like a link at the top of our Moodle page.
Yeah, I looked through that.
Okay, yeah, if you're confused about it. And if you have questions, you can just send me an email too, and I can help you.
Hmm. And I know I can't do the quiz 1. I know I can't do that in the first discussion forum.
I'll reopen.
But
I can reopen that. I'll reopen that quiz for you so you can complete it, and you can still do the annotations from last.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'll read those and give you credit for that. So,
Thank you so much.
yeah, no problem.
Okay, and Tuesdays, I'm gonna try to make it to some of them, but my boss is he won't give me the day off for Tuesdays. But he did give me every Thursday off, so I'll be here for that time.
Cool.
Thank you.
All right, yeah, no problem. I realize we're still recording actually, but
Oh.
okay. But yeah, so you might miss a lot of the Tuesdays, but I am going to be recording all of these, and you can find the link to the YouTube playlist where I upload.
Yeah,
them.
I saw that.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Okay, well, yeah, just let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.